Ship's Method seminar. Today we're very fortunate to have one of our own. He's a senior statistician at our center. He's been with us since 1999. We started together, so we were like 12 years old when we started. We're only in our 20s. Anyway, so Scott has a habit of making really cool titles out of hopefully very exciting talks. So instead of Game of Thrones, we're going to have Game of Phones today. And he's going to be speaking a song of daily imports with missing observations and the models that analyze them. And I think this is very timely because over the past few years, we've had this great innovation and ways to collect data using mobile phones, and this opened doors for HIV research as well as other research. But when you're talking about collecting data, instead of interviewing folks every 6 months, you're collecting daily information. So that poses a lot of challenges in terms of how to analyze this really dense, intensive data. So Scott will be here to share some light on it.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for being here. It's always humbling to talk about missing data in the presence of Dr. Bellin, too, missing data guru. So I'm happy to have him here as well. See if I do this thing right. So before I launch into analyses on missing data and all that, I just wanted to first talk about, it might seem like an obvious question, but why? I think we should always ask that question first before we launch into new toys and doing things a new way. What's wrong with the way we've been doing things all along? Well, so the first thing is, why cell phone-based data collection? Well, one obvious answer is cell phones are already a part of our daily lives. People are used to carrying them around. We already enter data on them on a daily basis. So it's really just a natural data collection tool. To throw in some terms, when we enter data on a daily basis, often several times a day and in the moment, we commonly refer to that as ecological momentary assessment. And on cell phones, sometimes it's called CEMA. So just to throw a term in there. Another nice thing with cell phones too, it's just amenable to event reporting if you're using drugs or engaging in sexual behavior and other things, versus if I ask you 3 months down the road to recall how many times you used drugs or some other event, you have to reconstruct those events in your mind and try to figure that out. So, the event recording on the phones, you're in the moment, you just press a button and it's right there, it's recorded. So those type of things really make mobile phones a nice option, especially when you consider the way we've typically done things. People have to come to a laboratory or clinical setting. Even if interviewers meet them at a Starbucks, they may still be influenced to give more socially desirable responses, and there's other biases that are introduced. And also, too, cell phone-based data collection blends nicely with cell phone-based interventions, which was coined ecological momentary intervention by a nice paper in 2010. One of the main ideas of it is that if you record your behaviors on a frequent basis, on a daily basis, you become more aware. And in some cases, this self-monitoring can even lead to behavior change, we often call reactivity. So just thinking of a practical example from one data set that Dr. Swendeman collected recently on HIV-positive individuals, when you actually look at individual patterns of sexual behavior over time, there's some individuals where risky sexual behavior tapered off very quickly. In qualitative interviews, when we talked to the participants, some of them said, well, you know what? Just recording what I was actually doing made me become aware that, wow, I'm having a lot of unprotected sex. So that reactivity to recording the behaviors actually helped as well. So cell phones have a lot of nice benefits to them. But we also do have to keep in mind what's an acceptable burden to the participants that are engaging in entering data on cell phones. We're kind of used to thinking of, with the traditional studies with retrospective recall, people have to schedule office visits, so that's a burden coming into the office. Although that's changing a lot now with web-based assessment. So that's kind of even the playing field. People can do it in the comfort of their own home. But there is a commitment over a longer period of time. Usually these studies go for, say, several years, and so people have to commit for that period of time, relative to EMA or CEMA studies where it's maybe collected over a couple weeks. But EMA also has a cost. They're simply the daily assessment. I'm sorry, what's that, Del?
Excuse me.
Oh. There's the daily assessment. Oh, welcome. Come on in. Yeah, go ahead. There's plenty of room.
Yeah, we just started.
We just really got started. I was just talking about some of the things, like why cell phones, you know, why do we want to use them, and some of the benefits. And actually, since Dr. Swendeman walked in, I was referring to his study in talking about reactivity, where one individual simply monitoring their sexual behavior led to behavior change because they became more aware that they were engaging in a lot of sex. So I gave your study as an example, Dallas. Yes. So moving down the list here, the EMA has its own burden that it entails. So I have to say, trying out some of the EMA assessments myself for a week or so, it gets pretty intense trying to fill out a survey 3 or 4 times a day. And after a little while, I kind of said, oh man, this kind of gets to be a burden. So that's something we really have to consider, you know, weighing the cost of different study designs. What's the burden on participants? Will they participate? Are they going to buy in? And so we really have to know the population. So what are some good candidate populations for CEMA that we've found in our own experience, other people, and just based on compliance rates? Well, one thing, patient populations are probably good candidates for CEMA. These are people who are pretty motivated if they're going to join a treatment program to begin with, so you've already got some buy-in. And we've had some pretty good results. I mean, to give a couple examples, crack-addicted homeless patients, compliance rates of over 80%. I believe that was over a couple weeks. We found in one of our studies here with youth and outpatient drug treatment here in Los Angeles, again, compliance rates of over 80%. So these are people who are really vested in the treatment program. There's a lot of buy-in up front. You think of non-patient populations, however, compliance rates have tended to drop a lot. We have Dr. Swendeman here, who did a nice pilot study on HIV-positive adults, also in Los Angeles. Thinking of another study in Australia on youth in a health clinic. Pretty low rates, around 50%. I think the youth study was even lower. So, I mean, that's pretty troubling. When you start getting to 50%, you have to start wondering what kind of biases are being introduced. But at the end of the day, even if you have high compliance, you can only minimize the burden so much. You're going to have some degree of missing data. And so an unwelcome guest of longitudinal data remains missing data. I guess I thought of this picture thinking of Thanksgiving coming up and many people having different relatives showing, like Cousin Eddie from National Lampoon's Vacation here. Oh, hi. Arlene, welcome. Come on in. Well, so before I talk about the specifics of CEMA and missing data, I feel like I just need to give a brief overview of missing data and some of the terms we typically use. So I just made this little chart here to kind of summarize. If we start at the top, and data is just missing completely at random. It's not dependent on any data. I think an example of this could be, I know when we did the CLEAR study quite a few years back and we started using computerized assessment, the interviews would just crash sometimes for no apparent reason. And so in a situation like that, it's missing completely at random because it's not dependent on the participant or any other factors. It's just random chance. So that's what we call MCAR. Well, as we move down the continuum here, we encounter what we call missing at random. This is when the missing data depends on observed data that we do collect. There might be demographic characteristics or other things that impact. And modeling, standard models can adjust for that. Well, the danger zone here is when we get down to data that is dependent on unobserved data. So for example, if people are tending not to fill out daily reports when they're using drugs, that's problematic because we don't observe that. And so we call that missing not at random, or NMAR. And that's actually going to be the focus of the talk today, on introducing some modeling strategies for dealing with NMAR. Well, so what are the consequences with MCAR, just missing completely at random? The obvious thing is you get a smaller sample size, less power to make inferences on. But the danger is really when you move into missing at random, missing not completely at random, you can end up with biased estimation if you don't make adjustments. Well, what does this mean in practical terms? Well, quite simply, you're going to draw incorrect conclusions from your data. There's some really nice examples in the substance abuse literature. I just listed one below from McPherson in 2012, where they give an example. If you analyze a drug treatment effect, accounting for and not accounting for missing data, you get very different results. And so there's some analyses in that paper. So just to give an overview, what are some tools we use for missing at random? And again, this is data, missing data dependent on observed covariates that we can adjust for. There's actually a lot of tools. There's multiple imputation. Our standard regression modeling techniques account for this. I think it's worth mentioning with generalized estimating equations versus standard likelihood methods to make this distinction. GEE adjusts for missing covariate observations. It doesn't handle missing outcome observations or make that adjustment. But if you move into the likelihood-based methods and Bayesian approaches with random effects, this does adjust for missing data that is dependent on covariates as well as observed outcome data. So these are some of the tools. I should say too, I want this to be pretty informal. If you have questions, feel free to stop me at any point. So now let's talk about some NMAR data tools for longitudinal data. And again, this is the danger zone where missing data is dependent on unobserved data. Well, there's actually two main approaches in the literature that are model-based. I have seen some papers on NMAR imputation and some other techniques, but today I'm going to focus on model-based approaches that you can run when you're running a regression model. So the two main approaches, the first one is really pattern mixture models. And this was introduced quite a few years ago. And here's the basic idea for that. Let's say that we have 3 time points and we observe the following missing data patterns where O is observed and M is missing. So the first row here, this is somebody we observe across all 3 time points. When we get to the second and the third rows, these are people who simply drop out of the study. We observe them at the second time point. In the third case, we only observe them at the first time point. And then the last person would be someone who's just missing in between. We call that intermittent missingness. So we have these 4 patterns. We fit a regression model and we include 3 dummy covariates. And we can pick any 3 of these patterns, but in this case, let's say we pick 000 as the reference group. And so we're going to include covariates for these other patterns. So this is a nice technique. It works quite well when you have a few observations repeated over time. And there's other pluses and minuses to the technique I won't go into here. But basically when we get into mobile data, where you have a lot of repeated measurements over time, it's not too hard to see that the number of possible missing data patterns increases exponentially. So this approach of pattern mixture models becomes less practical. You know, it's harder to narrow down how many missing data patterns you have, and so we want to start thinking of another approach. And that's going to be the talk I'm going to go into today. So the second main approach is what we call selection models. And here's the basic idea. I'm going to show some formulas in a few slides, but just to give an overview of what's going on. The basic idea is that we fit a longitudinal bivariate outcome model. So we're going to come up with two outcomes. The first outcome is going to be for the observed data that we would normally model, and the random effects account for missing at random. But we're also going to add a second outcome. We're going to construct an outcome for the presence or absence of missing data. And then we're going to put in a covariance structure to allow these two outcomes to be correlated with each other. So as far as the data structure, if we take somebody, say they have a binary outcome, and this is for one participant, they have 3 time points. Let's say they're missing their outcome at the second time point here. So then in our file that we have, data structure, we have observed data for 2 time points, and then we're going to create another outcome variable, and that's going to be 0 when the data is observed and 1 when it's not. So we're going to have these 2 sets of outcomes that we're going to model. So this is a basic overview of missing data techniques, and these have actually been around for quite a while. So you might ask the question, well, why are we here today? You know, what's the point? These have been in the literature quite a while. Well, there's a good reason to actually revisit this in the context of mobile data, and I'm going to give several here. One is defining compliance with mobile data is not as easy as traditional studies. To give you one example, in one of the studies we did on youth and outpatient drug treatment, where they filled out a text message-based assessment, the way it would work, they would get a text that was sent to them that would prompt them. They would then respond. They would get the next question that would come in, and this would follow until the assessment was done. Well, obviously, if people are busy, they're doing other things, or if we happen to catch them when they were using whatever was going on, they might not respond right away. So the way the assessment was set up was for each question, if they didn't respond, a couple minutes later, the question would be repeated. If they didn't respond again, the question would be repeated yet again. I believe that happened twice. So when we look at the duration that the assessments lasted for, you know, some people breezed right through the assessments. It took a couple of minutes. But there are some outliers where people took several hours. There was one extreme example where somebody took 12 hours. And I think in retrospect, we probably should have limited the time frame a bit more, but that was a programming issue. So, you know, how do you define compliance in that case? Where do you make the cutoff? If somebody takes 12 hours to respond to the whole assessment versus a couple minutes, it's not as straightforward as it is with a traditional study where if someone doesn't show up for an interview, they're not compliant. It's a lot simpler. But there's also possibly different types of missing data patterns that are problematic with mobile data. If you have a traditional study that lasts several years, people might be more likely to drop out. So you might drop out, might be your most pressing problem. With CEMA data, and I think Dallas can comment on this too, people tend to stay in the studies. We don't have as much of a problem with dropout. They only go for a couple weeks. I guess we had one that did go for 6 months, but even with that, dropout really wasn't a problem. Where we encounter the problem is people not responding to the assessments during the study. We call that intermittent missingness. There might be certain days or blocks of days where they just don't respond. So the missing data patterns, in contrast to traditional studies, they're a little bit different. And so those are some of the issues that we have to think about there. Well, apart from the issues too, different statistical models are also appropriate. So to give one example, the covariance structure that describes correlations between repeated measurements. So if we think of a traditional study with only a few time points, maybe 2 or 3, we can assume probably equal correlations between those time points, and a random intercept suffices. Random intercept model is a very good stable model used quite a bit. Well, as we move into mobile data, what's actually also been termed intensive longitudinal data, and there's a whole nice book by Walls and Schaefer that talks a lot about that. We have to think in terms of maybe more autoregressive covariance structures where time points that are closer together, we assume them to be more highly correlated than time points that are farther apart. And so we need to start thinking of more appropriate time series data structures. Now I'm going to put that out there for the illustration today. We had a very small sample size. I do have some code for fitting autoregressive structures. On the example that I'm going to present, that's not incorporated into the model, but it is something to think about, and something, if you're interested, I have code for that as well. And I should say too that this last point, why do we need to revisit this topic? Because quite simply put, we're really just starting to learn how to model missing data in a longitudinal sense for traditional studies, let alone moving into CEMA. And given that cell phone data is certainly here to stay, we kind of need to catch up and develop statistical methods and get more involved in implementing these models. And just to give you an example, so what are the limitations of current commercial software if you would like to implement NMAR models in them? This is certainly not exhaustive, and it might be debatable, but these are some things that I've found with commercial software. They work pretty well for continuous outcomes. And so to give an example, Bent Mutan et al. In 2011 did a really nice job analyzing depression data from a very large study using M+. So M+ is a very good standard software package. But they assume that the psychological scales were normally distributed, so they fit a continuous model. Well, as all of us know here in public health, we don't usually have nice continuous outcomes. Our outcomes are usually indicators for drug counts of unprotected. And in all honest, psychological scale normally distributed. I think back to one of my first biostatistics. One of the professors, give me an example of distributed variable. Said, oh, a liker kind of scowled at them and said, promising career in the social. Put their hand down. I've certainly fit continuous scales. We do what we can. You know, it does give the cost. Assume things are because they're psychological scale. But a lot of times with where that's what you're limited, complex, and don't have other options. Limitation, standard software outcome models. Specify, say you have to specify the other as an outcome. Chicken and egg problem, you're modeling variable. You might not really as a predictor and the other is you really prefer treats both variables so you can model the core time. Readily available in commercial software NMAR models. Two of the limitations NMAR models to anything else. Yeah, certainly.
Second to the last point, that so when so that's about measuring stuff, the whole about how to best someone's behavior is an example that you pointed out about methods to collect. So for example, seed and urine screen is like in mixed met triangulation of measure, and then if it's to measure a same and have concurrence, then it's
right.
The problem is you have CEMA report and urine screening, and you don't really have an idea which one is like the most accurate, and
right.
three modes of data collection are conflicting with one another. So what are your thoughts on how to handle situations like that? And each data reporting has distinct assumptions attached to it. Like CEMA.
Yeah, well actually that leads in nicely to the following slides, but I'll talk about it a little bit here. So one of the nice things about fitting bivariate models, or trivariate if you can get them to fit, is if you model the outcomes over time, you can model different distributions for the outcomes, although admittedly those types of models are hard to fit sometimes. And if you have, for example, you gave the example of different time frames, you can model the different outcomes across different time frames and include random effects that capture different chunks of time and allow those random effects to be correlated and to hopefully capture agreement. So that's one example, but you bring up a good point because it's certainly not an easy, there's really no easy solution.
Right, and I think Dallas spoke on this too. So when you're talking about so in HIV field, medication adherence.
Right. Yeah.
So the whole idea is if you have urine screen or drug use, for example, if you do urine screening, if the drug is detected, then even if the person says, I never use drugs, then
right.
That person used it. But in terms of even urine screenings, there's limitations because it just tells you whether the drug is in your system.
Exactly.
But because of the half-life, so the person might have used it yesterday, but maybe he or she might have been
right.
clean 3 months ago, and then 3 months ago she said, I was clean.
Yeah.
So the retrospective report would say no drugs, but the urine
right.
test comes out to be positive. So I think it's hard to kind of decipher which is the honest answer.
Right.
And different ways of collecting that information, will give truth, but we have a hard time figuring out what's the truth.
Right.
So I think that's the issue that I struggle with.
Well, and I think that's why it is important to model these different things jointly, because you can get random effects that give you higher or lower levels of an underlying pattern of, say, drug use that's going on.
We can model all 3 types of data collection jointly.
Right, and actually the example I gave, which you made a nice lead into that, I am going to show an example where we have self-reported drug use and urine screenings, and we jointly model them together. And I know in one of Dallas's study, like for example, he collected self-report, the daily reports, and, or wait, I might be mixing up studies now, but I know one of them, Dallas, there was urine,
urine, EMA,
and retrospective reports. We haven't, that's right, we haven't started looking at that one. But I think the message to all this is there is no perfect gold standard like we were hoping, and we want to collect these different data types and figure out better ways to combine them, definitely.
I'll just throw in a point. The reason, we often assume the biomarker, like a urine screen, is the gold standard, but we have these problems like in the Dr. Wu's data, Nancy's data, where people reported drug use, but the urine screen came up negative. So what do you do with that if they report that they're using, self-report? They're
right.
open and honest about something that they theoretically would be more inclined to lie about, but the urine screen comes out negative. So urine screens, and if you talk to people that do biomarkers and develop those biomarkers, they say it's kind of the big sort of unspoken, hidden problem with biomarkers, that they have varying sensitivity, specificity, they have error, different labs, different times of day, samples
right.
collected, sent to the labs. There's a lot of error in biomarkers as well.
Yeah.
That's a great example, and it reminds me of, and tying in with Scott's comment about the importance of modeling the joint distribution. In the context of census data, in the past it used to be that a majority of the people who were recorded in the census as being over 100 years old were imputed. And the reason was that a certain proportion of people, the method that they were using for doing imputation was based on one person in a household who had a recorded age and another person in the household who had a relationship to the head of household but didn't have an age.
Mm.
And a certain proportion of people who are, where the parent is filling out the relationship, they say, what's the relationship of person 2 to person 1? Instead of saying child, they'll say parent, so that the 35-year-old living at home with the 65-year-old parents gets recorded as parent as the relationship to person 1 and gets imputed to be over 100 years old. So
Interesting. Yes.
So it ties in with I think that your example there seems like one. And what you could do actually in a multiple imputation approach is, maybe 1 time out of 5 impute the person to be over 100, and 4 times out of 5 impute them to be 33 or something like that. So, or, within their 30s. So, there are different ways of representing uncertainty that, and that obviously would add a lot. But on the biomarker one, you might think that it's pretty reliable to know that if they're saying they're using, then they're using, and that the error would have been with, that you've caught a missed sensitivity error or something like that.
Right. Definitely. Yeah, that's a good point, Tom. So what are really some of the software implementation issues? Well, a lot of it comes down to the maximum likelihood methods, which are certainly good methods, nothing against them. They've been around for a long time, and they suffice for many standard regression analyses. But you do end up with these convergence issues for more complex models, such as these NMAR models. This is where we run into challenges if we try to fit outcomes that are not continuous, we try to fit multiple outcomes. Of any of you who have tried in, say, SAS, for example, trying to fit really complex models, or Stata, or any other packages that use maximum likelihood or related algorithms, you run into problems pretty quick with longitudinal data when you get the more complex models. So what's one solution? Well, for today's talk, we're going to focus on Bayesian methods. Now, before I talk about Bayesian methods a little more, I will admit, because I'm a Bayesian statistician, so I might be a little biased, but it's not a perfect solution. There is still a computational burden that's present, it's just shifted. So with maximum likelihood, the burden is on maximization and some of those other details. You shift some of that burden to more simulation. And I'll talk about a little bit more about that in a bit. With simulation, it is a decreasing barrier as the computational speeds continue to increase. So that's not as much of a barrier. But there is still the computational burden with the models. Another big one is you don't have a single convergence criterion as you do with maximum likelihood methods. So if you fit something in SAS, for example, it's nice because you look at your log window, and sometimes that green message or forget if it's blue comes up and it tells you, convergence has not been achieved. And so you say, okay, well, this model didn't fit. It's very straightforward. With Bayesian methods, the trade-off for flexibility and being able to fit complex models is you don't always know if your models have converged. So you have to look at diagnostic plots. So that's really key. And we're going to talk about that in some of the slides, and I'm going to show you some basic diagnostic plots. Another thing that this has created wars between frequentist statisticians and Bayesian statisticians is with Bayesian statistics, you have to specify a prior distribution along with the distribution of the specified outcome that is always done with maximum likelihood. So you do introduce an additional piece into the modeling. Ironically enough, introducing that additional piece gives you more flexibility in modeling, but it is something you have to be aware of, that you're making additional assumptions sometimes, and so sensitivity of the results to different priors are also important. But let's just launch into an illustration using a pretty popular Bayesian software package, and we're going to fit an NMAR longitudinal model. So for our study data, this is taken from 24 youth in outpatient drug treatment here in Los Angeles. They pilot tested a text message-based mobile assessment once a day. They were queried on alcohol, drug use, and context, things that they were feeling prior to using and related variables. And they were assigned to receive a daily or end of the day. This is a once a day report that they filled out around 9 p.m. or they received a random assessment sometime between 3 and 9 p.m. This random assignment is a little bit different than what's usually done with EMA. The reason for 3 p.m. and later is because the adolescents were in school, so we didn't want to disturb them during school hours. So both the daily and the random is a once a day assessment. So this is the basic study frame. So for eligibility, it was really pretty straightforward. They just had to be in treatment for at least a month at this particular treatment facility. And so we're considering that one rotation if you're in the treatment program for a month. So during the rotation, they filled out the mobile assessment, and they also received urine screenings roughly twice a week.
Do they have to
Yes.
go to treatment every day? Is it outpatient?
It's I should have mentioned it's outpatient, so it's
day
not every.
treatment? It's day treatment.
It's day treatment, yeah. It is outpatient day treatment. Yeah, that's a good point, Mary Jane. So they could participate if they were in treatment for longer. They could participate in up to 4 monthly rotations, and they had a month rest in between. It's kind of considered like a washout period. So the incentive, they were given $25 a week, 500 free cell phone minutes a month. So just to briefly comment, this actually generated pretty high interest to participate. We really didn't have trouble recruiting participants. I know Nancy Wu, the PI on this, was pretty happy. You know, there was the free minutes. That was a pretty big incentive for the youth. And there's just the coolness factor, being involved in a mobile phone study. They liked it. So really the only limiting factor why we only had 24 youth was because Nancy only had one research assistant, and there was only a limited number of phones that had to be rotated between participants. But overall, the youth were pretty excited to participate. So we're going to talk about today, there was a number of drugs assessed, but we're just going to focus on marijuana. This is just to give you an example of one participant in one rotation for a month. So for the mobile reports, as you can see, this person reported no marijuana use, and on their urine screens, they also came up all negative. This is somebody who was in the study for multiple rotations, roughly in month-long blocks. Looks like they kind of skipped over here. And most of the time, again, for EMA, they are not reporting marijuana use. There's a few blips along the way. Urine screenings, again, were mostly negative. But it is interesting, if we talked about this a little bit already, here's a case where we have positive urine screens here, but if you look at the actual reports, they're all negative on the
So,
self-report,
but
yes.
the half-life of marijuana can be 2 weeks.
That's
So
true.
why wouldn't you think that they've reported one yes, and there's a cluster of the yeses on the urine screen? So wouldn't
Right.
that have to do with the potentially with the
How,
precision and sensitivity of the drug screen?
how
Yes, that
often
was
was the
a-
urine screening?
It was twice a week. But yeah, that is a good point. It has a lot to do with that. And that's one of the kinks that needs to be worked out.
Because again, you really only have these 2 points that might not be accounted.
Exactly,
Because these could
right.
be associated with this use, and all of these could be associated
You associate,
with that use.
yes, it's very true. Yeah. So the sensitivity and specificity of the tests and figuring all that out, that's another huge component
Sure.
we haven't tackled yet. But very relevant. It's something that needs to be tackled. So just to show you some summary statistics, these are the different drugs that were assessed. If we just look at the median number of days that was reported out of the total number of reports across the 24 participants, we see that, you know, on average or the median, it was pretty low. You know, if you look, for example, on ecstasy going down to meth, you know, half the people, the median, they said they didn't use at all. If we look at positive urine screens, similarly, we actually have pretty low use that was picked up by the screens themselves. It was also pretty low. And, I'm going to skip ahead here. I'm running low on time. Just to give a brief overview, so generally, compliance was pretty high. Urine screens, the compliance was pretty good, but not quite as high. Again, this required people to come in or submit to the screenings. We didn't actually have any dropout during rotations. So we're really talking about intermittent missingness here. And so overall, drug use is pretty low, compliance is pretty high. So this does make it a little bit difficult to look at missing data issues if people are complying and they're not really using. But nonetheless, we can still illustrate the modeling on this. So we're going to model marijuana use. We're going to model self-reported use as indicated by the mobile phone data. We're also going to model the positive urine screenings. And we also want to model non-response for both outcomes as well. So the software we're going to use, I have website links on here. It's called JAGS. It's a popular package, very similar to WinBugs and another one called OpenBugs. The commands are very similar. The downside, it's got the ugly black dialog box, kind of the DOS-like interface. A nice solution is you can also run JAGS through R. So basically you install JAGS on your computer, you then install the RJAGS library within R, and then you just open up R and you activate the library and you just type all the commands in R, so you don't have to deal with the ugly command line interface. And I'm going to show you some commands. So this is actually the only slide I'm going to torture you with formulas, but given the shortage of time, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I'll just briefly talk about. So we've got 4 binary outcomes that we're modeling. You've got one binary outcome for self-reported drug use through EMA. You've got another binary outcome for a positive urine screening. And then you've got 2 binary outcomes for non-response or not. Non-response for EMA, non-response for the urine screenings. So in all, we have 4 binary outcomes that we're modeling. So we're going to fit a logistic model, as you normally would. We're going to model the probability that the event occurred, either the person used or there was a non-response. So the first model to possibly start with is where we simply fit a separate random effects for each outcome. And just to give you the notation really briefly, we've got our logistic model. We've got our random effects eta here on the end. So we have a separate random effect for each rotation and a separate random effect for each outcome. Now, if we had more data, we could also fit random effects for each person as well as each rotation. We could also fit autoregressive correlation structures, but again, we have a small number of people, so we're going to keep it pretty simple. Well, what we found in fitting this model with random effects for each separate outcome, we actually had pretty small values for the covariance parameters between the different outcomes. They were extremely small in absolute value, except between the outcomes for self-reported use and screening. So the implication there is that, I mean, it's a good thing. The self-reported use matched up pretty well with what the screening picked up, despite that one slide we saw where the person had positive screens and their self-reported use was negative. But in probably most cases, when people self-reported use, the screenings also indicated that. So thus the high degree of correlation between random effects on the use outcomes. So another model we might consider, since most of the random effect correlations were pretty small, is to reduce the number of random effects. So that's the second model we considered here. And again, this is the only slide where I'm torturing you with notation. So I'll talk about this a little bit here. But we're going to have a shared random effect for the first outcome, which is self-reported use, and for the positive urine screening. And we're going to allow that shared random effect, this eta, to differ by a scale parameter. So that basically means that people's level of use is shifted up or down, but the scale parameter allows that shift, the probability of using, to differ by a set amount. That's what that scale parameter does. So some of the covariates we put into the model, an obvious one is time in the rotation. Prior studies have shown in EMA data that the longer you're in the study, the more likely you are not to respond. It's probably not a surprise if fatigue sets in with frequent assessment. Another one we put in was just the rotation type. Did you get a daily prompt at a set time, 9 p.m. every day, versus did you get it at a random time between 3 and 9 p.m.? That might affect your non-response. So that's another covariate we're putting in. What makes this modeling to model the NMAR type data, this makes this approach kind of unique, is for the model, for the missing data indicator, we actually put in the EMA use outcome as a covariate in the part of the model where we model non-response for EMA. And in the part of the model where we model urine screening non-response, we put in the urine screening outcome as a predictor in that part of the model. So a non-significant regression coefficient for that outcome indicates a lack of evidence that an NMAR mechanism is present. So we have one more very detailed slide. I'm going to just go through this to talk about. So this is just an example of some of the JAGS code. So if you're familiar with SAS and programming in NL mixed, it might look a little bit similar to you. Basically, we have around 1,000 EMA data points across individuals. And so what this model does is we basically iterate through these 1,000-some data points, and we're telling JAGS that, okay, the EMA use outcome is distributed as a Bernoulli distribution. It's a 0, 1. And we're going to set this up with a logistic link, and we have our fixed effects, and then we have our random effects. And what's inside the bracket here indexes the random effects by rotation. So in other words, we don't have 1,178 random effects. We only have however many random effects correspond to this variable, which in this case is 40-some, I think. So this takes care of the EMA reported use. Yes.
So it's observations per rotation?
Well, it's
The 40 is observations per rotation? How do you
the 40
define-
is the number of total rotations across people.
Oh,
So there's 20-some people and there's 40-some rotations. So some people only had one rotation. So then we also model the presence of a missing EMA response. And again, that's Bernoulli. What makes this an NMAR model is for this missing outcome, in addition to our fixed effects, this is time and rotation and some of the other basic fixed effects, we're also going to put in this EMA use variable as a covariate in this part of the model. So as you see, this EMA use variable ends up as an outcome in the first part of the model, but you also put it in as a predictor in this part of the model for the missing data mechanism. And so when you look at the results, if the parameter, I just arbitrarily called it UC, if the parameter corresponding to this covariate is not significantly different from 0, then we conclude based on this model we don't see evidence of NMAR. If it's significant, then what that's saying is the use, whether or not the person uses, is related to a missing response. So that's how you set that up. So this covers the self-reported data, and then we do the same thing for the urine screens, only we've only got 310 total urine screens, but the modeling looks very similar. And then down here, we describe our random effects. So this is the model where we assume across the 4 outcomes we have separate random effects. So we're simply saying it's multivariate normal. Let's see. Which way do we go? Oh, this way. There we go. We assume it's multivariate normal with some mean and variance parameter. So this is only a snippet of the code. If you're interested in further code, I'm happy to send it to you. I didn't include the prior specification and some other things in here, but this gives you a really basic idea of the model setup. So, diagnostic plots. Before I show you results in the next couple of minutes, I'm going to run through diagnostic plots really quickly here. So what are things we look at? So these are plots I'm showing for the EMA drug use covariate, and the different columns correspond to the 2 models. The first model is where we have separate random effects for each outcome. The second one was when we have some shared random effects. So basically the first model is much more complex, harder to fit. We see some evidence of that. Things to look out for. In the Bayesian method, you're basically drawing samples from the posterior distribution of the parameters, and then you take the mean of that to come up with your estimates. So some things you want to look out for. You would ideally like to see, if you look at the density of the samples from the posterior distribution, you'd like to see a normal distribution. So if you look at that full model with separate random effects, it's much more complex, harder to fit. You see that this distribution is a bit more skewed, a longer tail off to the left. This one is still a little bit skewed, and these measurements are a little bit different, but this one is not quite as skewed. It's pulled in a little bit more. If you look at autocorrelation plots between the lags of the samples that you draw, one of the problems with Bayesian analyses is they tend to be correlated in complex models. If they're very correlated, you're not really getting random draws from the posterior, and your estimates are not going to be very good. So you want to see the correlation to be pretty low. Again, if you look at this model, if you look at the lags here, this is just the lags between the random draws, you see here the correlation drops off more slowly. This is a little bit deceptive because these distances are much shorter than these distances. This goes from 0 to 500, and this is 0 to 50. But in actuality, these autocorrelations drop off much more slowly in this complex model. So that's another thing to watch out for. Lastly, if we look at trace plots, we often take, or you should take, multiple chains when you take the random draws. You basically start at different points in the distribution and you sample from the posterior. You'd like to see that the chains mix well together. If you see things where the patterns go separately, and they never really come together, then that's problematic. So you see pretty good mixing with that. So I'm just going to talk about the results really briefly. What did we see with this data? So we've got our model for EMA reported use, yes, no. We really just ended up with two covariates, or one covariate. Everything has an intercept. We have one covariate for daily versus random assignment. Another outcome for positive screening, yes, no. We didn't end up with any covariates in that part of the model. We have random effects for this part of the model, and then we have our non-response model. One non-response outcome for EMA reported use, and one for positive screenings. So what I'll talk about here is if we look at the NMAR variables, and so for example for the non-response screening, that would be this screening variable here, which is actually an outcome up here. If we look at the estimate and the standard deviation, we would conclude that this is not significant. So the implication is, at least based on this model, we don't see evidence of a non-ignorable missing data mechanism going on. Other things to point out, not surprisingly, days in rotation is actually associated with non-response over time. So the longer you're in, the more likely you are not to respond. Not a tremendous surprise there.
Scott, I know we're running out of time, but looking at the positive, the screen test.
Yes.
So for the marijuana use, so you said it's like, who came up with the protocol to do drug testing, like marijuana, you're doing testing like twice a week? So I'm thinking, isn't it, so if like Mary Jane pointed out the half-life, so if you go in on Monday and then you're positive, so the next one, within a few days, isn't that dependent on the result of, so if you're positive, you're going to be positive again. So this model take that into account? Because I think it seems like if the first assessment during the week, if it's negative and it's positive the second one, that's informative. But then
Right.
It seems like it's like causing participant burden. If you already know that you're positive on Monday, you're going to be positive anyway the next urine screening. So I'm thinking
Yeah,
it could
I
be
mean,
more.
that's a good point too. I guess they were hoping that the screens were far enough apart that didn't occur, but I mean, that's certainly a possibility. So probably a better model would take into account what is the prior test result
Right,
instead of
because
the...
you certainly don't want to miss the drug use during
Right,
the week, but if
yeah.
you already captured it, then it seems like you can adapt the frequency of screening to take into account the
Right.
half-life, for example.
Yeah, actually, that's a really good point. Yeah.
Picking
Okay.
up on that, if you don't mind my
Yeah,
jumping in
yeah.
on it, because I think it ties in with Dallas's and Mary Jane's question earlier about that in some sense, like once you have the framework and you have the ability to fit sophisticated models, then it becomes a modeling challenge. Like how do you actually
Yes,
specifically
yeah.
do the modeling? And point that I was going to make related to that is that it's great to have, I mean, this is, makes progress on these, making accessible these non-ignorable models that are really hard to fit, and now you're doing it with pretty accessible software and making it happen. But another strategy to think about, and I think to get the creative juices flowing for all the CHIPS investigators, is the idea of measuring something else that transforms the problem from a non-ignorable modeling problem where you don't have any data and you're making some assumption about the outcomes being related to things that you haven't observed, versus to measure something else that makes it ignorable or missing at random. And the example that really unlocked this idea for me was my advisor and a subsequent graduate student working on a problem in census where when you can't get responses in a household interview, ultimately you go to a proxy interview, like a neighbor or a relative. And so then the question was how to do modeling for the error structure with proxy respondents. And a lot of times you think, well, maybe the proxy respondents were more like the late respondents, and maybe the remaining non-respondents are more like the proxy respondents. But another idea was you usually only collected a proxy when you didn't get another interview. How about if you also collect some proxies for people where you did get an interview? And then it becomes a sort of a simple structure where a simple measurement error structure where you have, X and Y on a bunch of people, and then some people where you only have X, now you want Y. It just becomes it's
Right.
much more straightforward. But it's the creative side of deciding to collect.
Right.
It's sort of counterintuitive, and then once you do it, it's like a wow, I had a V8 sort of moment, and then you I can have one.
Only to a statistician.
I can't resist. Actually, the earlier exchange we had also reminded me. So it was just earlier today. I had this. I was talking about when you impute variables independently and don't take account of their joint distribution. We sometimes call that the pregnant male problem, because you can impute gender and impute pregnancy, and sometimes if you're not taking into account. And then the person I was talking to said, yes, but I just saw that in Chile, a transgender male married a transgender female, and the male with the uterus was the one who carried the child. so in our modern world, now we have some pregnant males that we have to make our lives more complicated and interesting, right? Anyway, I'm sorry.
No, that's a good point. That's actually probably a good stopping point. I just have to conclude yourself. Pregnant males, that's the take-home message. Don't discount them. But yes. But yeah, just have some conclusions. So, but thank you all for coming. Great to see the interest in here. Thank you. Yeah.